Hello, welcome to part 5 of the Salisbury axle project. Today I'm going to be going over to the garage to trial fit the Salisbury axle on the Land Rover for the first time using those new spring saddles that I made. Right, it's time to try to trial fit the Salisbury onto the springs. You can see I've got one spring. Oh, you can't see. You can just about see in the shadows there. The fast spring is already partially engaged on the chassis, and now I'm going to attempt to manoeuvre the axle into place. Well, we're getting there. The axle is roughly in the right place, still suspended on the jack, and I've got the fast spring is attached front and rear. Sorry, you can't see this too well in the dark. And now I'm going to get the spring on this side in place, and then I can start to lower the axle down onto the springs. You might be interested in why I've taken the trouble to put some writing on the springs. The reason I've done this, obviously I've got OS on this side and NS on the other side, offside and near side, and I've marked an arrow towards the front as well, so I know which way these have to be put on. I've also written on, in pretty big writing, slide axle forwards at this end. On the other side I've got the same thing with an arrow backwards, slide axle backwards. Remember that the hole in the spring saddle is 13mm, so there's a little bit of wiggle room, and when I was rebuilding these parabolics, I found that the springs were not quite the same length, and clearly the most important dimension is from the front bush to the center hole, and any inaccuracy at the end is taken up by the hanging spring shackle. But this dimension was slightly different for the two springs, and so in order to correct that, I figured that I would have to slew the axle, if you like, on the spring, although what I'll actually be doing is making sure that it's true. I must say these parabolics are Rocky Mountains, made 15 years ago, probably 20 actually, and they are not great on quality control. There doesn't appear to be any effort to match them for height. Both front and rear, the left and right springs were different heights, and that's not because they thought one was going to go on the driver's side. There's no indication of left or right. It's just pretty shocking quality control. One of the reasons I rebuilt these parabolics is because I wanted to swap them over, because ever since I fitted them 20 years ago, the Land Rover has been tilting down slightly on the driver's side, obviously particularly when I'm in it, but even when I'm not in it, it tilts down on that side, and that's not so good. So when I got these off, sure enough, I found that on the front and the rear I had slightly lower springs on the driver's side. And that's the way it's been right from the time that they were new. They just weren't matched properly. They weren't designed to go left and right. If you buy springs from people like Hasty, who's in the Netherlands, I believe, those springs, they actually have a left and right. But no, Rocky Mountain, they made no effort to do that. So anyway, I'm fitting the higher springs on the driver's side this time, and hopefully that will sort out the ride height problem. And all the other measurements I took will, I would like to think, mean that the axle is going to be straight in the chassis. Oh, and by the way, before you all comment, well, the springs have just sagged on the driver's side because you've been using it for 20 years and that's where all the weight is, on the driver's side. But no, the Land Rover was sagging down on that side right from the day that I first fitted these. So the saga proceeds. I've got the Salisbury axle into place and got the parabolics screwed up, not torqued up of course. This is just a loose fitment now for trial purposes. The axle is just resting on the new spring saddles. I've taken dimensions from the outer flange to the spring saddle to make sure that those dimensions are both identical on either side. So in theory, as long as the leaf springs aren't severely out of line, if those dimensions are the same on both sides, I'm assuming that the axle is centered. I've put the U-clamps on and the plates underneath. Those are just pushed in place at the moment. Now you can see that these U-clamps aren't absolutely vertical. One of the pair on each side is slightly off vertical because of the problem that I mentioned, that sure enough the bump stop pad, which effectively provides a certain amount of limitation to where the U-clamps can go, is not absolutely in line with the position of the new spring saddles. So I think that the amount of error is not enough for me to worry unduly. I think the U-clamps can be moved around into position so that they might both be very slightly not vertical, but it's not going to be enough to cause a problem. I can just clamp them up. It does rather bring home just how agricultural these Land Rovers really are. You can take all the measurements that you want, but ultimately it's a little bit slap it together and hope, which I really hate to say that, but certainly with regard to the position of these U-clamps, that seems to be the way of it. What I've done now is to drop the weight of the Landy down onto the axle stands. So the axle is just resting casually on top of the springs, but the springs are taking the full weight of the Land Rover as if it was on the road. And I've got the height set almost exactly according to how it would be if the wheels were on. So that's a fairly good approximation of standard running conditions. All of this is with assuming that there's no weight going to be carried in the back, which is the normal condition. Normally there's only me or maximum one other person in the Land Rover, and I don't carry anything routinely in the back, passengers or otherwise. One thing that I will do is I just want to bounce around a little bit on the back of the Landy just to preload the springs. So here we go. Oh, yep. Hey. Okay, so I'll just bounce up and down a little bit on this. If it wants some extra weight to settle, then my weight will do the job, I'm quite sure of that. Now we're in the right position to delve into the murky situation regarding operating angles for the prop shaft. That's the input flange, that's the flange on the front of the diff. The diff is still only held up by a piece of wood, so I can rotate that freely around the new spring saddles, and I can start measuring the angles. So now we're under the Landy, as you can clearly see, and we're right up to the output flange coming out of the transfer casing. And what I'm going to use is this little gizmo for measuring angles, and because I've got this disc on here, I can actually use that to take the angle. Yeah, just stick the hold on and there we go. That's saying 0.58 of a degree downwards, which is what you would expect. The engine and gearbox line is slightly downwards in the Land Rovers. I'll take the hold off and we'll come to the output flange, the input flange to the differential, and we'll measure that. Okay, and that's showing 4.28, again downhill effectively. So that's no use. I need to lower the nose of the diff in order to bring this angle to be very close to being the same as the 0.58 of a degree that we measured on the transfer box output shaft. Okay, so I've moved the support under the diff a little bit. Not exactly a technical process, as you can imagine. And now we'll put the gauge on again, and this time we're seeing 1.2, 1.2. So that is between half a degree and 1 degree different to the output shaft from the transfer case, but that's actually about right.
You'll recall that the requirement from Spicer is between 0 and 1 degree in difference between the input and output flanges. So if we've got roughly about 0.6 there, isn't it? Now, of course, that's going to change a little bit when you tighten up the U-clamps and when you remove the axle stands and everything's actually sitting on the tyres on the road, then that angle will change a little bit. But it seems that working in the ballpark of 0.6 of a degree difference between the two is pretty spot on. So we're good to carry on.
While I was under the Landy, I took the opportunity to measure the distance between the nose of the diff and the output flange from the transfer casing, and it was 51 centimeters. And the reason I wanted to measure that is because this Bailey Morris prop shaft came to me supposedly custom made, like most of the extreme Bailey Morris props, based on dimensions that had been given by the previous owner, and I just wanted to double check that this was all going to be within tolerance. So the distance between input and output shafts is the 51 centimeters, and that's what I've got the prop set to right now. And you can see the light grey area here. This is the amount that the prop is currently extended away from its minimum dimension, and with these Bailey Morris props the prop can extend out right across to about here somewhere. Basically the minimum, when it's at its minimum, the prop shaft is 48 centimeters long. This is how it looks when it's at 51, and the maximum it'll go to is about 59 centimeters. So this looks pretty promising. I would like to think that at any compression or extension of the suspension, that prop shaft should be well within its tolerances.